She walked into his life for a moment, and quietly changed the direction of his forever. I still think about that afternoon the way people think about storms they didn't see coming. It wasn't dramatic. No music swelling in the background, no sudden realization. Just an ordinary day, moving at its usual pace, until it quietly wasn't. I was 25 then, old enough to feel the pressure of becoming someone, young enough to still feel unsure about how. I remember standing in line, half lost in my thoughts, when I noticed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. She stood with an ease that suggested she'd already made peace with herself. Her posture was relaxed, shoulders back, movements unhurried, as if time adjusted itself around her instead of the other way around. When she turned slightly, our eyes met for a brief moment. There was no smile, just a calm acknowledgement, polite, observant, steady. It was the kind of look that made you feel noticed without being examined. I didn't know her age then, only that she carried something I didn't yet have, certainty shaped by experience. The first words between us were practical. She needed help reaching something, or maybe it was holding a door, something small enough to forget, yet impossible to overlook afterward. As I handed it to her, our fingers brushed. Not a spark, not electricity, something quieter. Warmth. Her hand was steady, confident, the touch unafraid. That half-second lingered longer than it should have, and in that pause, I felt strangely grounded, like my thoughts had finally stopped racing. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and composed, carrying the calm of someone who chooses her words carefully. I nodded, suddenly aware of my own voice, my posture, the way I stood. I didn't feel smaller in her presence, just more awake. She didn't rush away. Neither did I. We exchanged a few sentences that stayed safely on the surface, yet somehow felt heavier than they should have. When she listened, she didn't interrupt. When she spoke, it wasn't to impress. There was an ease in her silence, a comfort in the pauses between words. I realized then how rare it was to feel that kind of space with someone you'd just met. As she adjusted the strap of her bag, her sleeve brushed against my arm. The contact was accidental, but she didn't pull away immediately. I felt the soft pressure through the fabric, the subtle warmth that stayed even after she moved back. It wasn't desire that unsettled me, it was recognition. As if something in me had been quietly acknowledged. Before leaving, she offered a small, knowing smile. Not flirtatious. Not distant. Just warm enough to stay with me. As she walked away, I watched the measured confidence in her steps, the way she carried herself like someone who had been tested by life and hadn't lost her gentleness. I didn't know her name. I didn't know where that path would lead. But I knew this much with an unsettling clarity, whatever direction my life was heading in before that moment, it had shifted. Not violently. Not suddenly. Just enough to change everything. I told myself the first meeting was nothing. A coincidence, a brief human moment I'd read too much into. Life has a way of doing that, handing you something small and letting your mind turn it into meaning. I expected the feeling to fade. It didn't. A few days later, I found myself in the same place again, not because I needed to be, but because some quiet instinct pulled me there. I noticed her before I realized I was looking for her. She was seated this time, a book resting in her lap, glasses balanced low on her nose. She looked up as if she sensed me, her expression softening with recognition. Not surprise, recognition. That alone made my chest tighten. "Back again," she said lightly. "So are you, I replied, and the familiarity in my own voice surprised me. We talked longer this time. Nothing dramatic, just pieces of our days, the kind of conversation that usually stays polite and forgettable. But with her, every exchange felt intentional. She didn't fill the space with unnecessary words. She listened in a way that made me finish my thoughts instead of abandoning them halfway. She asked what I did, where I thought I was headed. I hesitated, searching for answers I didn't fully have. Instead of pushing, she smiled gently, as if uncertainty wasn't a flaw but a stage. "You don't have to know yet," she said, and somehow that felt like permission. We sat closer than before. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to be aware of warmth. When she shifted, her knee brushed mine, brief, unintentional. She didn't apologize. I didn't pull away. The contact lingered in my awareness long after it ended, like a quiet echo. I realized how rarely I felt comfortable enough to stay still in moments like that. At one point, she laughed, soft, unguarded, and reached out to steady herself, her hand resting on my forearm. Her grip was light but certain, fingers warm against my skin. The touch carried no urgency, no demand. Just ease. Just presence. I felt something settle inside me, a sense of calm I hadn't known I was missing. What struck me most wasn't the attraction, it was the way she saw me. Not as someone to impress her, not as someone unfinished. She looked at me like I was already whole, even if still unfolding. That kind of attention does something to you. It makes you stand a little straighter, speak a little more honestly. I noticed the details then, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, the confidence in her posture, the patience in her pauses. She carried her years gracefully, not hiding them, not apologizing for them. Being near her felt like stepping into a quieter rhythm of life, one that didn't rush, didn't demand, just existed. When it was time to leave, neither of us stood immediately. There was a pause, comfortable but heavy, like a question neither of us voiced. As we finally parted, she met my eyes again, holding my gaze just a second longer than necessary. I walked away knowing one thing with unsettling clarity, I hadn't returned by accident. And whatever this pull was between us, it was growing, slowly, silently, without either of us asking it to. By the third time we met, the unfamiliar had softened into something almost comfortable. Not routine, never that, but a quiet expectation, like a page you'd been meaning to return to. I noticed it in the way my steps slowed as I approached her, in how my thoughts settled before I even spoke. She looked up and smiled, not wide, not performative, just enough to let me know she was glad I was there. We talked the way people do when they've stopped skimming the surface. The easy topics faded, replaced by pauses that invited honesty instead of filling space. At one point, she asked me how I felt about where my life was going. Not what I planned. Not what I hoped others would see. How I felt. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, fingers tightening briefly around my cup before I answered. I told her the truth, about the pressure of expectations, about the quiet fear that I was falling behind some invisible schedule everyone else seemed to follow. I admitted how often I wondered if I was becoming the person I was meant to be, or just drifting towards something safe. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer quick reassurance. She simply listened, her attention steady, eyes never leaving mine. When I finally ran out of words, the silence didn't rush to judge me. It held. "That feeling doesn't mean you're lost," she said softly. "It means you're paying attention." Something in my chest loosened. She shared a piece of herself then, not a confession, but a fragment. She spoke about choices she'd made too early, others she'd avoided too long. About learning, slowly, that certainty isn't something you find, it's something you grow into. There was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity earned over time. As she spoke, she reached out without thinking, her hand settling on my shoulder. The weight of it surprised me, not heavy, but grounding. Her palm was warm through the fabric of my shirt, steady in a way that made my breathing slow. The touch felt deliberate, reassuring, like an anchor offered without condition. I looked up at her then, really looked. The confidence she carried wasn't loud. It was patient. It came from knowing herself well enough not to rush anyone else. When our eyes met, she didn't look at me like someone unfinished or unsure. She looked at me like a man in the middle of becoming, worthy of respect even in the process. In that moment, I realized how rare it was to be met like that. Not challenged. Not corrected. Just understood. The room around us seemed to fade. There was only her hand on my shoulder, the quiet between us, the unspoken acknowledgement passing back and forth. When she finally moved her hand away, I felt the absence of it immediately, like a warmth withdrawing. "I believe you'll find your way," she said, her voice calm but certain. "You already are." The words stayed with me long after we parted. Not because they promised anything, but because they reflected something back to me I hadn't fully seen yet. She hadn't changed my circumstances. She hadn't given me answers. She had done something far more powerful. She had seen the man in me, clearly, without hesitation, and somehow, in her seeing, I began to see him too. Awareness has a way of changing everything. Once it settles in, you can't pretend you don't feel it. By then, the space between us carried more meaning than the words we exchanged. Every glance lasted a fraction longer. Every pause felt charged with things left unsaid. And somehow, we both knew it. She was the first to create distance. It wasn't coldness, nothing like that. It was subtle. She arrived later than usual, left a little earlier. When we spoke, her tone remained warm, but more careful, as if she were measuring each word before letting it out. The closeness we'd fallen into so naturally was suddenly missing, and the absence of it felt louder than any argument could have. I told myself to respect it. To be grateful for what we had and not ask for more. But restraint is difficult when you don't know what you're holding back from. One afternoon, we found ourselves sitting across from each other instead of side by side. The table between us felt like a boundary neither of us had named. She kept her hands folded in her lap, posture composed, eyes attentive but guarded. I mirrored her without meaning to, shoulders tense, aware of the space I wasn't crossing. Still, the pull didn't disappear. It deepened. At one point, she reached for her cup, and I did the same. Our hands moved toward the center at once, stopping just short of touching. The moment froze there, my fingers hovering inches from hers, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She inhaled sharply, then drew her hand back, wrapping it around the cup as if anchoring herself. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "So had I." She spoke about timing, about how some connections arrive when they complicate more than they comfort. She didn't mention age or perception directly, but it lived in the spaces between her words. The unspoken awareness of how we might be seen. Of what questions would be asked if anyone looked too closely. I wanted to tell her I didn't care. That none of it mattered. But even as the thought formed, I understood her hesitation. Wanting something doesn't erase consequence. When I finally looked up, her eyes met mine with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Not fear, but responsibility. She wasn't protecting herself alone. She was protecting us, whatever that meant. As we stood to leave, she hesitated, then placed a hand briefly on my arm. Just above the elbow. The touch was careful, restrained, as if she were reminding herself where the line was even as she acknowledged the connection. Her fingers lingered, then withdrew. "I need to be careful," she said softly. I nodded, even though every part of me resisted the distance she was asking for. As she walked away, I felt the weight of everything that shouldn't be pressing down on what so clearly was. The tension wasn't in what we'd done, it was in what we hadn't. In the honesty waiting behind restraint. In the knowledge that the hardest part of connection isn't attraction, but deciding whether you're brave enough to face what it costs. And in that quiet pullback, I realized something else just as clearly. Whatever this was between us, it was no longer something I could step away from unchanged. The weight of silence can become unbearable when two people carry it together for long enough. By now, we had learned the rhythm of careful restraint, pauses, measured words, brief touches that hovered just on the edge of intimacy. But something inside me had reached a point where caution no longer sufficed. I needed to speak, to give voice to the quiet, persistent truth I'd been holding back. We were sitting on a bench in the small park where we often ended up by habit rather than intention. The afternoon sun spilled across the pathway, warming the tips of her hair, turning strands of chestnut to gold. I watched the way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of her sleeve, the same gesture she always made when she was thinking, and felt my pulse quicken with the urge to bridge the gap between us, not just the physical space, but the unspoken distance we'd maintained for so long. "I need to say something," I began, and the simple sound of my own voice startled me. She turned to look at me fully, eyebrows slightly raised, lips parted, not in surprise exactly, but in attentive waiting. That gaze, steady and patient, made me realize how long I had been preparing to speak while she simply waited without urging me forward. "I've tried to ignore what this is," I continued, my words hesitant but deliberate. "I've tried to tell myself it's not mine to want, not mine to pursue. But the truth is, what I feel for you, it isn't just fleeting. It's not about attraction alone. It's about how you make me see myself, how you make me feel capable of more than I ever thought I could be." She blinked once, softly, the sunlight catching in her eyes, and then she exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible sound. "I felt it too," she admitted, her voice low, trembling just enough to betray her usual composure. "I've tried to resist because I never expected someone like you. Someone younger. Someone who still has so much ahead of him. And yet here you are, and I can't deny it anymore." Her words weren't dramatic declarations, they were quiet, careful truths, like delicate threads being laid between us. I reached out then, almost instinctively, and placed my hand on her cheek. The gesture was tentative, reverent even, the way one might touch something fragile and precious. My thumb brushed lightly across her skin, and I felt the warmth beneath it, the subtle heartbeat I could almost sense. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, the faint pressure of her cheek against my palm grounding me in the moment. For a long while, we sat like that, foreheads nearly touching, breaths mingling, neither of us needing more than the silent affirmation of presence. I realized that speaking the truth hadn't rushed us forward, it had simply acknowledged what had already existed between us. I didn't change your life, she murmured after a while. You were already becoming who you needed to be. I just noticed it. Her honesty, her calm acknowledgement, struck me harder than any grand gesture ever could. And in that quiet confession, I understood something profoundly simple. She hadn't needed to save me, and I hadn't needed to chase her. All we had needed was to recognize the quiet gravity of what we meant to each other. In that afternoon light, on that unassuming park bench, the invisible lines we had drawn dissolved. The truth spoken softly had done what caution could not. It made us brave enough to finally meet each other fully, in all our hesitation, vulnerability, and undeniable connection. After that afternoon in the park, everything shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but in small, deliberate ways that felt more profound than any grand gesture could ever be. We didn't announce it, didn't rush into declarations or plans. We simply began to be, together, in the ways that mattered. It started with the little things. Our meetings became less about chance encounters and more about intentional time. We'd walk through quiet streets, side by side, talking about books, music, and dreams. There was no urgency in our steps, just a measured pace that allowed us to notice the world around us, and each other. The warmth of her hand brushing against mine, almost by accident, became something I looked forward to. Eventually, that brush became deliberate. Fingers intertwined naturally, holding on to one another not out of need but out of choice. She let herself lean on me in ways she hadn't before. Sometimes during long walks, her head would rest lightly against my shoulder, her hair brushing my arm. The sensation wasn't just physical, it was a trust, a surrender of her quiet defenses. And I, who had once been unsure of my own steadiness, found myself becoming a harbor she could rely on. Each step, each gesture, reminded me that intimacy didn't have to be loud. It could be subtle, patient, and infinitely more powerful for it. We spoke about the past less and the future more. Not in the sense of planning life together yet, but in acknowledging that we wanted to choose each other despite everything else the world might say. The age difference, the cautious glances from others, didn't disappear, but it became secondary to the connection we nurtured daily. We weren't chasing labels or rushing toward definitions, we were simply choosing, quietly, every day. Our conversations deepened. I learned her fears, her regrets, and the moments that had shaped her. She learned mine. We shared fragments of vulnerability, testing the strength of our trust without pressure. And with every revelation, our closeness grew, unspoken but undeniable. There were no dramatic confessions anymore, just steady presence, the kind that builds something lasting. The world around us faded when we were together. I remember sitting on a park bench one late afternoon, the sun soft on our skin, and she leaned her head against my shoulder, her eyes closed. I could feel the slow rhythm of her breathing, the subtle warmth of her body, the quiet weight of her hand resting on mine. In that moment, I understood what choosing each other really meant. Not possession, not urgency, but the deliberate decision to be present, to care, to invest in the intangible bond that had grown between us. And it wasn't just physical closeness. It was the shared smiles over silly observations, the understanding glances when words weren't enough, the patience when one of us hesitated. It was a quiet kind of love, the kind that forms when two people respect each other enough to let the connection breathe while nurturing it intentionally. By the end of that season, the choice was clear. Neither of us could imagine the other absent from our lives. The distance we once kept, the fears we once nursed, they had softened, replaced by steady devotion. We weren't rushing toward anything, and yet, in the calm certainty of our quiet moments, we had already arrived. Choosing each other didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was in the hand held without words, the shoulder offered without hesitation, and the quiet agreement that, despite everything, we would remain side by side. In that unspoken commitment, destiny quietly folded itself into our lives. Time has a way of making clarity out of chaos. By the time we reached this point, neither of us could remember the exact moment when uncertainty had turned into certainty. What had begun as a quiet, almost accidental connection had grown into something undeniable, a presence in each other's lives that felt essential, like gravity, like breathing. We had spent months learning each other's rhythms. I knew the subtle tilt of her head when she was deep in thought. She knew the way my fingers drummed when I was restless, the small ways I hesitated before speaking when I felt uncertain. These were small, intimate details, fragments of life that might seem ordinary to anyone else, but to us, they were proof. Proof that our connection was not fleeting, not superficial. It had roots. Deep, steady roots that had taken hold without either of us realizing it. One evening, we found ourselves alone on the balcony of her apartment, the city spread beneath us in soft lights that shimmered like a distant constellation. She leaned against the railing, her hands resting lightly on mine, and for a moment, we didn't speak. We simply let the quiet stretch between us, letting it settle and warm us. There was no urgency in that silence, only the weight of shared history, of moments too significant to name but too important to ignore. "You know," she said softly, finally breaking the quiet, "when I first met you, I never imagined this. I didn't think anyone could change my path, and yet, here we are." I smiled, feeling the subtle tug of her words. "And I didn't realize anyone could see me like you do," I replied. "Not as someone incomplete, not as someone to fix, but as someone becoming. You made me see myself." Her gaze lingered on mine, steady, unwavering. She didn't need to say more. We had both said what mattered. And then, as if to seal the moment, she pressed her lips gently to my cheek, a touch that was soft, intentional, full of the warmth and trust we had cultivated over months. It wasn't a rush toward passion, it was a quiet declaration of devotion, the kind that comes only after knowing someone truly. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her close, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of her body against mine. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder, and for the first time, I felt the full, breathtaking certainty of being chosen, and of choosing. She had changed my fate by simply seeing me. I had become her destiny by being present, patient, and willing to grow alongside her. We stood there for a long while, the city humming softly below, and I realized that destiny isn't something that hits all at once. It isn't a grand event or a sudden revelation. Sometimes, destiny is quiet. It is patient. It is measured in touches, in shared silences, in the small, deliberate choice to remain. As the stars began to emerge above, she lifted her head, meeting my eyes. There was warmth there, yes, but also certainty, an unspoken promise. We didn't need more words. We didn't need anyone else to understand. What mattered was that we had found each other, fully, honestly, and with quiet courage. And in that understanding, I knew we had arrived at the place we were meant to be. Fate had shifted. Destiny had arrived. And we had chosen it, together.